So, warm welcome to all of you. Happy to see you again. I hope you had good discussions last evening after Yuri Androchovic's presentation and our discussions, which I'm very confident we will continue this morning. But first of all, I would like to introduce Maria Todorova. When we designed this conference, we thought we were quite convinced early on that if we are going to address the question of imperial rule and colonial experience in Eastern Europe, we would need to place it in a broader, both methodic but also global context. And we quickly noticed that Maria Todorova was the person to ask. When I wrote to her and invited her to speak about the global context, she wrote back and said, I accept. I was very happy. And she said, don't expect an assertive talk. And I said, okay, now we'll invite you even more. Maria Todorova, just to give a very brief introduction, began her academic career in her home country, Bulgaria, in the 1980s before she went to the United States, became a professor of history, first in Florida, and then at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she has been teaching, I think, for 2.5 somewhat decades now. She also held many visiting professorships at various universities, mostly in Europe. Her most famous book, translated in many languages, Imagining the Balkans, is standard reading in our introductory courses, has been so for more than 2 decades now, and I expect it to remain so for many years to come. Among her many other influential books and publications, I would only like to mention very briefly a volume on post-communist nostalgia, another volume on remembering communism, and most recently a volume titled The Lost World of Socialists at Europe's Margins, Imagining Utopia, 1870s through the 1920s, which came out in London 2020, just before the pandemic. So Maria, thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
So I'm deeply honored by this invitation, and I thank the Deutsche Gesellschaft and particularly Joachim von Puttkammer for this invitation. I'm doubly pleased that Manuela Budatka is going to be my respondent, because I cannot imagine anyone more lucid and erudite to counter what I have to say. So we are here convened under the general rubric of imperial rule and colonial experience. It is not about imperial rule and the experience of empire, but about colonial experience. Thus, the phrase signifies that empire presupposes colonial experience. This poses 2 questions. Is any empire colonial? And is any experience with an empire colonial? It is, of course, and if some of it is, when is it? In the last 2 decades, roughly from the 1990s on, empire, which had been the orphan of nationalism studies in the 20th century, took off like a rocket. There is now an enviable corpus of synthetic studies on empire, which is dominating the 21st century body of works on states, and most of which is overshadowed by analysis on the British Empire. In our field, especially influential was Jane Burbank's and Fred Cooper's Empires in World History, among others because it paid close attention to empires functioning. How can I do it louder? Okay. I'm a little bit short. So should I hold it like this? It's okay. Okay. Like this? Is like this fine? Okay, good. Okay, so I was stopping at Jane Burbank and Fred Cooper. Its value is because it paid attention to the empire which were functioning in the eastern part of the continent, the Romanov, the Ottoman, and the Habsburg empires. Their book came out in 2010, and it was hailed as a foremost authorial synthesis. There is general agreement almost a consensus now that we have collective synthesis and even an encyclopedia on empire, that empires can be traced as far back as the record history goes. Indeed, most history is the history of empires. It is the nation state, an essentially 19th century ideal, that is the historical novelty and that may yet prove to be a mere ephemeral entity. This was the consensus. I say almost close to a consensus, since they were lucid, if softly stated, and polite concerns about these universalist accounts. Some came from scholars of antiquity who objected that empire is not a concept that has been used retrospectively. It was not used in antiquity. With little historical differences, the urge was to see structural patterns. The focus was on political history, and the contrast and break with the nation-state was too stark. In a way, it was an effort to gather all so-called imperial phenotypes within the same genotype. Complaints of errors of an area specialist notwithstanding, one has to recognize that it is the sweeping, sometimes overgeneralizing accounts that trigger debates, fruitful correctives, and advance knowledge. Still, one has to see these works in the context of the zeitgeist. And I admit, I know that particularly in a German audience, zeitgeist is also a controversial category, but I still think it is useful more so than, let's say, ambience or fashion. After the lamentable performance of nationalism in the wake of the two world wars, the reassessment of both the nation-state and empire was inevitable. The drive for homogeneity and uniformity of nationalism was juxtaposed to the complexity and relative ethnic and religious toleration, which was easily translated into tolerance. And there was a romanticizing tendency, especially as regards the British and the Habsburg empires. While Burbank and Cooper were free of this affliction, and despite their disclaimer that investigating the history of empires does not imply praising or condemning them, their narrative predictably led to the distinction with a stress on diversity. They were explicit in their motives to challenge the teleology of the nation-state as natural, necessary, and inevitable against the deeply entrenched, and this is a quote from them, litany that says history proceeds from empires to nation-states, end quote. They successfully made empire normal. But zeitgeist change. In the first two decades of the 21st century, empires or quasi-imperial formations were welcomed, including the ones who maintained they were not, like the United States or the European Union. While scholars were questioning the deterministic view that empires were doomed to failure and disintegration, now imperial entropy is elevated to a law, especially now with the war in Ukraine. It has found its voices, some scholarly and measured, as in the works of Serhii Plokhy, or strident, as in Anne Applebaum's, who writes, "The Russian Empire must die." Timothy Snyder is confident that the war in Ukraine will be seen as a colonial war and an imperial, I quote, colonial war and an imperial war in the sense that in choosing to fight this war, Russian elites were self-consciously defining themselves as an empire as opposed to a normal state, end quote. We are coming back full circle, from bad empires to good nation states, from bad nation states to good empires, from bad empires to good nation states. Zeitgeists have different norms of normality. The last quote introduces colonialism, ignoring Burbank and Copper's wise warning that imperial name-calling, invocations of the word empire and colonialism to discredit interventions of American, French, and other governments, does not provide means to analyze and improve today's world. But colonialism and its derivatives, post-colonial, post-coloniality, neo-colonial, quasi-colonial, decolonial, decoloniality, decolonization, transcoloniality are ubiquitous, just as are empire and its derivatives, imperial, imperialism, imperiality, inter-imperiality, and so on. Just to remind you, The annual theme of last year's AC's convention was decolonization. Although the then president of the association, Juliet Johnson, was more circumspect and spoke of decentering Russia. But for Eva Thompson, the author of Imperial Knowledge, Russian Literature and Colonialism, decentering was not enough. She was right to lament that the other Slavic languages and literatures in the United States were invisible and mute, but now was explicitly for canceling not only athletes from the Olympics, ballerinas, and opera singers. And she said, right now, I'm in sympathy with those who want to cancel such things. You cannot erase Dostoevsky and Tolstoy from the literary vocabulary, but you can simply not teach them at this point. Bulgakov simply should be dropped in the memory hole. In an interview last December, she added, quote, Russian literature is not very good if you take away Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Regarding the amount of literary works in existence, Russian literature is certainly smaller than British, German, French, or even Polish literature. And yet we sometimes treat Russia as if it is as productive as France and Great Britain. Courses dealing with trivial things such as, for instance, Pushkin's poetics should be removed. Forget about Nabokov on Pushkin. She also defined colonialism, the military conquest of a nation. Since she emphasized nation, this actually was interesting to me, as it pertains to my first question, are all empires colonial? For her, the conquests of Alexander the Great were not colonialism, because in those days, people didn't have the consciousness that they were members of a nation. She also held that Slavic studies were colonized and were Russian propaganda studies, and she named the main culprits. And you know them, Nicholas Ryazanovsky, Stephen Cohen, and Dmitry Trenin. The first two have died, the third is canceled. I'm retired. I'm not making a list of what I think is ridiculous name bashing, but just giving an example from a recognized scholar, not from politicians, and alas, today's journalist, whose professional task is to inflate what the French will call pisseur de copie. Stephen Howe has provided us with perhaps the most useful definitions of empire and colonization, allowing to start a meaningful analysis from a basic and unchallenged understanding. I quote, an empire is a large, composite, multi-ethnic and multinational political unit, usually created by conquest and divided between a dominant center and subordinate, sometimes distant peripheries. Colonization refers to large-scale population movements where the migrants maintain strong links with their ancestors' former country, gaining specific privileges over other inhabitants of the territory by such links, end quote. Howe's careful definition of empire allows for the elaboration of typologies, but also for a temporal distinction. There is a whole body of literature dealing with issues of understanding and defining the categories empire, imperialism, and colonialism, and colonial empire, colonialism, and the differences between them. Striking is the cavalier attitude toward the distinction between imperial and colonial. After all, at stake are very different theoretical framings in each case. In fact, most careful theorists lament that colonial and imperial are often used interchangeably. What specifically makes an empire a colonial empire, or if we take colonization in its literal sense of settling a territory or improving it, as last night's Laudatio finally showed the etymology, on that count, is any state colonial at its inception. Barbara Arneel introduces a useful distinction between colonization, historical process through which people were colonized, and colonialism, which is a common ideology used to justify such entities and processes. Imperialism is also treated as ideology. Adopting a historically attuned and comparative approach, she advances a fourfold argument. First, colonialism in the modern period is a modern ideology characterized by three principles: segregation, agrarian labor, and improvement, amelioration, of both backward, meaning idle, irrational, or custom-bound people, and waste or empty land via labor or education, providing justification for both colonies in foreign lands and for domestic colonies, so we have internal colonization. Secondly, in the 19th century, imperialism shifts from conquest toward civilizing missions, development and democratization, overlapping with the colonialist principle of improvement. By the early 20th century, imperialism is redefined by Hobson and Lenin as a global system of exploitation and extraction rather than simply domination. Thirdly, the two terms become fully conflated in the wake of the Second World War, when colonialism is redefined to mean exclusively overseas racialized dominions and becomes synonymous with imperialism. Finally, she shows that distinguishing the colonial from the imperial can explain how colonialism, rooted in amelioration, could be strongly embraced by many liberal, socialist, and anarchist thinkers from the 70s to the early 20th century, even as they forcefully rejected imperialism. Think of Weber, think of many people in the Second International. While at the same time, 20th century Asian and African leaders viewed themselves primarily as anti-colonialists inside a global system of imperialism. There is an overwhelming consensus that modern European overseas empires from the 16th century, that is, both early modern and modern empires, usually defined as colonial empires, do present a qualitatively new phenomenon. And that has to do with mercantilism, industry, and capitalism. I quote, "The essential point is that although European colonialisms involved a variety of techniques and patterns of domination, penetrating deep into some societies and involving a comparatively superficial contact with others, all of them produced the economic imbalance that was necessary for the growth of European capitalism and industry," end quote. No wonder the status of Ireland as a colony is the object of a very lively historiography, but the ones who accept the formal definition of colony limit it to the 19th century. Taking cue from the important distinctions between pre-modern and modern empires, I have argued elsewhere, here I come to my own turf, where I'm a specialist, that the Ottoman Empire was not a colonial empire in the modern sense. I will lay out my argument very, very briefly. A number of features do not allow us to describe it as a modern colonial empire, with a partial exception for the Arab provinces for the last post-Tanzimat period, when the Balkans had already seceded. First, there was no abyss of institutional legal distinction between metropole and dependencies. Second, there was no previous stable entity which colonized. The Ottoman Empire became an elaborate state machine in the course of shaping itself as an expanding polity, which was whole in all its territories. Third, there was no ameliorating complex, no civilizing mission to the French and comparable to the French and the English one, again, with the exception of the Arab provinces at the very end of the 19th century. Fourth, there was no hegemonic cultural residue from the Ottoman Empire comparable to the linguistic and cultural hegemony of the English and the French. And less so of the Russian in Central Asia and the Caucasus. These factors also apply as a whole to the Habsburg Empire. The one convincingly, but still contested exception as colonial or quasi-colonial is Bosnia-Herzegovina. While the imperial and colonial status of the Romanov Empire is not disputed, it comes with important qualifications. On the other hand, both imperialism and the colonialism of the posited Soviet Empire have been intelligently and openly debated, especially with the advent of the new imperial history. It is also important to take account of self-perceptions. Subjectivity matters, after all. None of the contemporaries in the Balkans in the Ottoman Empire felt that they were in a colonial positionality. The only ones who saw a kind of semi-colonial status vis-à-vis Western imperialism were some Ottoman intellectuals at the very end of the empire. For that reason, post-colonial studies had not really made a methodological inroad in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe until recently, in contrast to Wallerstein's world systems theory, immensely popular in Greece and Turkey, but also widely read in Eastern Europe even before 1989. Now, if you allow me, I'll make a small parenthesis. There is a curious instance of explicit decolonial subjectivity avant la lettre in the 1920s by none other than the Prince Nikolai Trubetskoy, who opposed pan-Romano-Germanic chauvinism as a synonym for Eurocentrism and deplored Russia's subordinate status like that of the ancient Mexicans or Incas. Russia, he wrote, will be a colony similar to India, Egypt, and Morocco. As Moore reviewed this and said he's wrong, linking Russia to many types of physically colonized peoples because Russia itself was one of the world's great colonizing powers. But he's right because so much of the broader world has said, for the last century at least, to define itself in part with regards to Western Europe. Of late, recently actually, Botakos wrote a passionate opinion piece in Al Jazeera arguing that Russian imperialism was overlooked because Western scholars ignored the colonial character of the Soviet Empire and its dissolution came without decolonization, even though Florian Bieber had warned that the need to abandon Russia-centrism is not well described by the term decolonizing when it comes to Western academia and research, as it conflates Western bias toward important and large powers, such as Russia, with Russian colonialism or imperialism. There is no question that today, not only in Ukraine, the Baltics, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, but also increasingly in Eastern Europe, from Poland to Bulgaria. The period of Soviet dominance is represented as colonialism, and now the call goes, it is the time to decolonize from this legacy. All I can say, and I stand corrected, is that both internal critics of the Soviet Union at the time and external ones, that is, the ones who were not afraid of censorship or practice auto-censorship, spoke of oppression, subjugation, plundering, even slavery. The empire was authoritarian, totalitarian, murderous, genocidal, evil, but not colonial, as far as Eastern Europe was concerned, except in jokes when people were saying that the colonies were less backward than the metropole. I'm not saying that the decolonial perception is wrong. There should be freedom for subjectivity and, its expression. But I insist that this perception is a neologism in the contemporary emancipatory discourse coming after the 1990s. Why specifically decolonization is used over a quantity of other analogues has mostly to do with its metaphorical and liberating power, evoking the saintly figures of Mahatma Gandhi and Frantz Fanon. I made the argument about the Ottoman Empire at the high end of post-colonial studies when I was urged to link my notion of Balkanism to Orientalism and directly to post-colonialism. The appeal came exclusively from literary circles and philosophers who care less about ahistoricism. While it is true, one of my friends claimed that the social, political, economic relationship between the European imperial powers and their overseas possessions differed from those between the Ottoman Empire and the Balkans, why could the wars of independence against the rule not be considered post-colonial? We land, I think, in the midst of methodological conundrum. Is every national movement necessarily anti-colonial? And does it always produce a post-colonial situation? Was Garibaldi unifying Italy against Austrian colonizers? Should we explain Fichte's address to the German nation as a post-colonial critique of French occupation and hegemony? Are Kurds in Turkey, Iraq, and Syria weighing an anti-colonial struggle? Did Croatian, Slovenian, Muslim, Bosnian, or Kosovo Albanian nationalism culminate in an anti-colonial war against a Serbian colonizer? Is ETA the post-colonial avant-garde of Basque nationalism, I plead professional deformation, but to me, time-bound and place-bound specificity counts. It counts not only to avoid cognitive deformations, but matters as well as on ethical grounds. The emancipatory mantle of post-colonialism all too often serves as a cover for the perpetual lament of victimization and inadvertently reopens the door to nationalism. It is in the wake of the successful anti-colonial struggles after the Second World War that scholars from the previous colonies were faced with the lingering effects of the colonial legacy, and this gave the spur to what eventually was promulgated as post-colonial discourse. Post-colonial studies have an established epistemological pedigree in post-structuralist theory, but their very concrete provenance is from the subaltern historians of India from the 1980s. The link to Orientalism was identified by positing a lifespan from Said's Orientalism to Hart's Negri Empire to 2000. The post-colonial field meant different things to different people. One may generalize that what occurred in the quarter century after the appearance of Orientalism was a disciplinary shift in post-colonial, global, or third world studies away from sociological and economic studies toward cultural, theoretical, semiotic, and discursive analysis. Simultaneously, post-colonial studies challenged the theoretical models and metanarratives built on the earlier dominant paradigms of modernization, development, and world systems theory. The problem is that post-colonialism itself became a new meta-narrative, although it is fair to say that despite some conservative hysteria, it was never really institutionalized. Incomparably more attention is paid to and means given to the study of globalization, something that is an eloquent illustration on the different ideological baggage of the two. Nonetheless, it undoubtedly achieved a honorary status. What is very interesting to me is that precisely at the time when some were positing the melancholic phase or even the end of post-colonialism, some East European intellectuals posed the question of their relation to the post-colonial. Mostly, however, they referred to the post-socialist period and the involvement of Eastern Europe in the process of globalization. Contemporary East European intellectuals increasingly see themselves in a subordinate position vis-à-vis the centers of knowledge production and discrimination in the West, and some explicitly speak of intellectual neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism, self-colonization, whence the identification with post-coloniality and decoloniality. This is where, according to me, an opening is produced through which post-colonial and decolonial theory finds an attentive ear among a new and young intellectual clientele. I repeated my argument about the Ottoman Empire a decade later, responding to a different framework, one suggested by Timothy Snyder. In his theoretical proposition, he offered a global binary process between integration, disintegration, which in a bold conceptual leap was translated into colonization, decolonization. I quote, "A historical framework that permits Ukraine to be seen as a subject and an object of the projects of integration and disintegration is a link between European history and global history, which might help us make sense of present conflicts, and making sense of them just might help bring them closer to an end." Integration and disintegration is indeed the safer bet because the two pairs are dichotomies, mainly because it is difficult to specify them historically. It is general enough to be universally applicable, but what does it tell us specifically? How is it different from any cyclical or even helical view from other dualities like centralization versus secession, conquest versus resistance, subjugations versus opposition, or the rise and fall genre. The Romans integrated the Mediterranean world and then disintegrated. Over several millennia, China experienced several waves of integration, expansion, and then disintegration, contraction. The Incas exerted their imperial rule before they themselves were conquered by the Spanish. And this can be argued ad infinitum, so with endless historical examples, so the exercise, I think, becomes meaningless. In a leap of faith, based on the assertion that European and global history are separated by the word colonial, Snyder the dichotomy integration, disintegration morphed by Snyder into colonization, decolonization. And here came the claim to a theoretical contribution which triggered my response. Decolonization does not bring, according to Snyder, that does not begin in the 20th century Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but in Europe, more specifically in the Balkans. Quote, Balkan revolutions against Ottoman rule, usually categorized as national, were the beginning of the decolonial moment, end quote. Not only did they pioneer decolonization, but their model of nationalism becomes more significant than the French one. This argument surreptitiously reproduced the divide between Western and Eastern type of nationalism. Furthermore, it posited that the Balkan model succeeded as a method of disintegration, but failed as a method of reintegration. Reintegration into what? Into the then existing Habsburg Empire, or the rising German Reich, or as a province of the Russian Empire, or a Danubian and Balkan Federation, which was mostly espoused by socialists who were an anathema in Europe at that time, and that was not allowed. Snyder unwittingly raised the negative specter of Kleinstaaterei. The practical purpose of Snyder's model was to create a breathing global Gaia between gaps of integration and disintegration, colonization and decolonization, which serves as a receptacle of Ukraine, aiming at the present moment to achieve an integrative Hegelian Aufhebung. And this is fine, as long as it is recognizable as a political platform, but not as a scholarly contribution. From my perspective, with neither a colony or a colonizer in the 19th century Balkans, the employment of the concept decolonization is gratuitous. Not every form of subjugation and power hegemony can be termed colonial. Not every resistance is decolonization. The point here is not for me to propose my interpretation as true. Rather, my insistence is on a minimum level of professional rigor that is necessary for scholarship to thrive and progress. There are consequences to a careless attitude to concepts. Imprecision and lack of meticulousness makes the concepts unworkable. This leads to misidentifications, misconceptions, and errors. It means essentially a breach of the conventions of the historical and any other scholarly academic profession, and precludes a critical engagement with other scholars' work. Admittedly, I speak for academia, and I'm aware of the critique against limitations of logocentric academic thinking and disciplinarian rigidity. And indeed, I'm arguing now against myself. Definitional rigidity can be broken in order to open space for innovation, for new theoretical or conceptual moves. It can also be motivated by considerations outside strict advancements of scholarship. There are numerous examples of this kind, with the rethinking of the notions of class, gender, race, the social, the everyday, which have launched the new perspectives of inquiry and have advanced knowledge. Scholars have broadened the definition of the colonial, post-colonial, and decolonial for specific purposes, most often to join them to a broader universal conversation. A major impulse in this direction was Sharat Chari's and Catherine Berger's intervention by introducing a dialogue between post-colonialism and post-socialism. Implicitly, the premise in their articles was the equivalence between capitalist empires and the crumbling Soviet one. And there was subtle critique of the analogies they made between post-colonial and post-socialist, most serious being the ones that they made an erasure on the contribution of the Second World to Third World struggles. But for others, Chari's and Verdery's article opened up categories used almost exclusively to conceptualize the non-European experience, and thus empowered East European intellectuals by propelling them into a paradigm which was speaking a universal knowledge. The attraction to both post-colonialism and decolonial theory stemmed also from the fact that they emanated not from the metropolis, where theories were generalized exclusively on West European examples, but from the periphery, from India and from Latin America, with which East European scholars could easily identify. Here I want to specifically address the contributions of a young, talented cohort of scholars, luckily, no, mostly from the Balkans, I have to say, who have been directly inspired by the Latin American decolonial theoreticians. I hold them in very high esteem and think they have produced some brilliant work. This group includes a broad variety of professionals: philosophers, sociologists, political scientists, literary scholars, anthropologists, urban historians, art and architectural historians, visual culture and media theorists, performance studies, geographers, feminist critics, artists, and a number of activists. And a disclaimer, there is no hierarchy in this enumeration. But tellingly, there are no ordinary historians among the group: economic, social, or political historians. But as a forum of these decolonialists pointed out, earlier scholarship had primarily taken place within the disciplinary domain of history, while nowadays the aim was a decidedly interdisciplinary intervention. But good historians destabilize not with grand historical narratives which can serve as an enemy, but with specific and space-specific analysis, while they do not oppose at all for going beyond static typologies and fixed geographical units of scales to argue for interconnectivity, and the best use interdisciplinary tools. In fact, in the last few years, work by young East European historians has gone very much beyond the regional framework toward Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Still, lest my remark seems too defensive, there is indeed a generational differences, and it has to do again with this terrible word, the zeitgeist. The world of earlier generations of scholars like Larry Wolff, Milica Bakic, Vesna Golworthy, and myself, indeed sidestepped, if not entirely ignored, questions of political economy. This was so not because we were blind to the problems, but because in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, when we produced our work after the end of the Warsaw Pact and the demise of the Soviet Union, the central political issue was inclusion into or exclusion from the European framework and the ghettoization of the Balkans. This was also an activist position, but it had inevitably, of course, its blind spots. Some nearly 20 years later, with the brutal effects of the neoliberal capitalist experiments, including shock therapy, radical austerity, privatization of commons, flat tax, wage cuts, flexible employment, and forced vacation, whose real impact was difficult to anticipate at the very outset, a new generation boldly inscribes itself into the anti-capitalist and decolonial tradition, while at the same time subtly criticizing it for having erased Eastern Europe, especially East European socialism, with all its ambiguities, and subsuming it under the rubric of capitalist modernity. All these contributions are inspired by decolonial thought as it was developed in the late 1990s by scholars and activists representing indigenous movements in Latin America. We have Quijano, Dussel, Mignolo, Escobar, Grossfogel, and many others. An important article summarized the conceptual advantages of decolonial critique for our region. Most important, the authors maintained, is the effort to foreground the historical experience of state socialism as a way of collective coexistence in the forms of practices, social mores, institutional arrangements, alternative systems of value, that was often in significant tension both with Occidental reason and the logic of capitalist accumulation, end quote. Other benefits are the repositioning of Eastern Europe on the semi-periphery of both global capitalist and global colonial hegemonies by pointing to structural homologies. Yet another most interesting contribution is the thinking through world regions and the stress on imperiality. The notion of imperial difference describes the modern empires that were structured along the modes of coloniality in the 16th century, the Spanish and the Portuguese, the so-called First Modernity, which lost power or fell under the domination of the other Western imperial colonial powers, England, the Netherlands, and France, the Second Modernity of the 18th and 19th century. To them are added the second-rate or not quite Western modern empires such as the Ottoman Sultanate and the Russian Empire. So this is the gist of the decolonial framework. The momentous task of decolonial thought could then be understood as the work of recognizing and undoing the colonial difference and the imperial differences operating in given localities and historical moments. It is through the encounter between colonial and imperial differences that a colleague of mine, Nikolai Kharkov, explains Eastern Europe's dual status as both a semi-periphery to the capitalist world system as an aspirationally white civilized part of colonial Europe. The concept of imperial difference was also applied by Manuela Boatka to explain how different parts of Eastern Europe, beginning in the 16th century, followed a sequence that went from proto-colonial to neo-colonial at best, but in the absence of formal colonization, end quote. The concept of coloniality of power is elevated as a central explanatory idea, even as it shows some uneasiness with its globalizing claims. And of course, you have Ticindignano, who is speaking of, we rather should speak about de-occidentalization rather than decolonization. Now, my sensitivities are that of a historian, and I understand that ahistorical thinking is not as irritating to others, interested primarily in methodology. But the stark separation and juxtaposition of a first and second modernity is artificial. The issue is what these separations are serving. In the case of the first and second modernity, it is a critique of Eurocentrism, also involving Latin America, but also identifying it as a pioneer of modernity, reminiscent very much of Benedict Anderson's modular theory of nationalism, which started in Latin America. Spain and Portugal in this reading are the first modern nations, and they start the first stage of modernity, world mercantilism, with control over the Atlantic, the world system, and modernity begins in 1492. The second stage, the Industrial Revolution, simply expands what began in the 15th century. Can we call this search for precedents Latin American centrism? Decoloniality has traveled from the modest Americanicity as a concept, this was Quijano and Wallerstein, to a globalizing meta-narrative. Inter-imperiality, Laura Doyle's felicitous concept, she's a literary scholar, so it rhymes so well with intertextuality, has been successfully employed in the terrific and original work by Anca Pervolesco and Manuela Boatka, Creonizing the Modern. Inter-imperiality can go with coloniality, but also without it. And it is analogous to what I call the palimpsest of legacies, not only imperial ones. In a recent forum on her book, Doyle bemoaned the overuse of modern and wanted to ditch it altogether. She said, "I wonder what other word can be used here," she exclaimed. I also wonder what other word can be ditched. I'm not fighting against the concept of decolonization. This is impossible. Lots of people are using it. It is here to stay. For how long is a different question. It has become a koine, a lingua franca, unifying diverse voices of a new generation. Some use it thoughtfully, others gratuitously. But the koine has its dialectal differences and uses different pitches. The beasts or ghosts against which decolonization is directed are different and very often opposing. Capitalism, neoliberalism, colonialism, imperialism, imperial legacies, communism and communist legacies, nationalism, racism, misogyny, homophobia, Eurocentrism, progressivism, Euro-Atlanticism, Western civilization, the Russian Empire, the United States, genocide, stereotypes and representations in arts, media and education, academic studies, and so on. We all have to decolonize. Strangely, and I would stand corrected again, there are calls for decolonizing traditional and subordinated religions, but I have not yet seen calls for decolonizing from religion as such or from traditional mores. Is it because they have to be decolonized from the Enlightenment, understood as radicalized modernity, one of modernity's dark sides? This is also the parlance of decoloniality. And are we going to come full circle to decolonizing the Enlightenment and reestablishing some of its bright sides? The worst thing we can do with words is to surrender to them. Let the meaning choose the word, not the other way. This is George Orwell, it's not me. The best of works of this new generation need not inscribe themselves within a certain vocabulary and use it like a mantra, which reminds me, I'm an older generation, of the mantras of the Marxist vocabulary in state socialism, even when they were correct. George Steinmetz asked, does it make sense to bring ideas like postcolonialism or a colonial present into discussions of present-day racism? Answers to this question depend on the context. As a historian, I'm all for contextualization and disambiguation, even as I'm aware that to be historically specific does not fail to be analytically universal. I understand and sympathize with the metaphorical use of decolonization as emancipation. I respect decolonization as an attempt to involve our region in a universalizing discourse. I am all on the side of those who are the anti-capitalist and anti-neoliberal activist. But the difficult question is what comes next. Yet I'm puzzled by this monistic quest for a unified field theory or global theory, and urge awareness of the pros and cons of a unifying paradigm and an omnipotent word. Decolonization is omnipotent because it is a universal metaphor. Aristotle was right when he quipped that poetry is more powerful and more philosophical than history because it speaks a universal language, but history speaks only about the particular. In my favorite Molière play, Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, Monsieur Jourdain discovers that there are only two ways of expressing oneself, prose and poetry. And the quote is, whatever is not prose is verse. Whatever is not verse is prose. I admit that I speak prose. But when we analyze verse, we don't write another poem. We speak prose. Thank you.